You are listening to the Be Your Own Coach podcast. I am DeAnn LifeCoach Day. This is episode number 12. And today I am talking to you guys about identifying your inner critic. And I know that for some of you, this is a refresher. You are very familiar with the concept of inner critic. And for others, this may be the first time that you're learning about it and identifying your inner critic. But either way, it's important that we get familiar with our inner critic and that we stay familiar with it and that we learn how to be productive despite our inner critic instead of allowing it to keep us from being productive and creating the things that we really want for our lives. So, in addition today to kind of defining the inner critic, painting a picture of what the inner critic is, I'm also going to share 7 benefits to knowing your specific inner critic, and then I will also share 7 self-coaching questions that you can ask yourself that will help you identify your specific inner critic and help you to actually manage it in a strategic way when it shows up. All right, so to start, let me talk a little bit about what the inner critic is. So, the inner critic is something that we all have, and the impact that it has on our lives depends on how we respond to it. So it's like a negative voice inside of our brain that judges us and that criticizes us. And it's the part of our mind that tells us things like, you're not good enough, or, you can't do this, or you'll never be able to succeed at this. And because of the things that our inner critic says to us, it causes us sometimes to like doubt ourselves, and it'll lower our confidence, and it'll just hold us back in general from trying new things and from reaching our goals, because our inner critic is the negative voice in our mind that doubts and criticizes our abilities and our worth. It's important that we recognize when our inner critic is speaking and learn to challenge it. And when I say challenge it, like, don't just believe everything that your inner critic says to you, right? Challenge it. Like, if it says, like, you're not good enough, like, how does it know that you're not good enough or that you're not capable? Don't just take its word, like, challenge it. Um, or at least we need to learn how to like quiet it so that it's not speaking to us so loudly, so that we're able to think more positively and realistically about ourselves and our abilities. So that is the inner critic. Um, Let me tell you a few benefits. There are plenty of benefits to knowing your inner critic. Today, I'm going to share 7, right? So, the first benefit is that you'll have increased self awareness. Understanding the negative voice inside your head helps you recognize different thought patterns that you might have, or behaviors that you might tend to see when you're having certain thoughts. And this awareness is like the first step toward making positive change. Remember, awareness is always the first step. If you're not aware of what the problem is, then how can you solve it? So, your inner critic can be the problem. We just need to figure out, what is it saying? What is it doing? How does it operate in a way that's causing a problem so that we can solve it? So, increased awareness, that's number 1. Number 2, you'll have improved self-esteem. That's another benefit from understanding your inner critic. So by identifying and challenging that negative self-talk, you can boost your confidence and develop like a healthier image of yourself. Your inner critic tends to kind of break you down and make you see negatively, or make you see yourself in a negative light. But when you challenge it And when you get to know it and you can overcome it and operate around it, then that will help improve your self-esteem. A third benefit is that you'll have better decision making. So when you're aware of your inner critic, you're less likely to be swayed by the self-doubt that it creates within you. And you're going to be more likely to make decisions that are based on your true desires and the things that you actually value. The fourth benefit is that it can reduce stress and anxiety that you feel. So when you recognizing and managing your inner critic can decrease the anxiety and stress that often accompany the negative self-talk or the negative judgment. So when your inner critic is talking down to you or creating that doubt in you, it's also creating stress and anxiety. But when you're not listening to it as much, or when you're able to quiet it down, then that also will increase your ability to reduce the feelings of anxiety that you feel or the feelings of stress that you feel. The fifth benefit is that you might have enhanced relationships. So when you have more of a positive view, you're likely to interact with others in a more confident or compassionate or positive way. And that in turn is going to improve some of your relationships. So that's a benefit, improve relationships. You'll also have increased resilience. So when you understand your inner critic, it allows you to develop different strategies to overcome that self-doubt that it might present to you, or to like overcome any setbacks that might be created because of your inner critic. And it's going to make you more resilient when you are faced with challenges, because you are in the habit of like overcoming the negative self-talk that your inner critic speaks to you. And then lastly, the seventh one is that you're going to have more achievement, right? So by silencing that inner critic, you kind of free yourself to pursue your goals and your dreams without allowing the fear of failure to hold you back, or not allowing that self-doubt to hold you back, or not allowing like whatever the inner critic instills in you and typically holds you back. You're not going to be so I don't know, it's not gonna hold you back the way that it maybe does now when you're not aware of it, or when you don't have a strategic way to kind of overcome it. So those are just 7 benefits. I'm sure there's more, but today you got 7. Um, and so now I want to share with you 7 inner critic insight questions. And I call them inner critic insight questions because when you take the time to think through and answer these questions, you will have a clear understanding of your specific inner critic, how it works, and how it impacts you. And then you will also think through how you can use a different perspective to help you manage your inner critic in a strategic way that allows you to accomplish more. So that's why I want you to take time to, think through these questions. So the first question is, what kind of things does your inner critic say to you? So for a lot of us, our inner critics tell us that we're not good enough, we don't have what it takes to succeed, we're always, messing up things, we're too lazy, why even bother trying? You're just gonna fail. What's wrong with you? Why can't I get it together? And your inner critic can also downplay your successes. So if you like have a great accomplishment, your inner critic will minimize it and make you feel like it wasn't that special, it wasn't that big of a deal. And then it typically tends to use harsh language when it's speaking to you, and it can be cruel, and it can be rude or mean, and it can cause us to feel anxious because of all the negative things that it's saying to us. But what does your inner critic say to you specifically? That's what I want you to do. I want you to figure that out when you're answering the question, what kinds of things does your inner critic say to you? Figure out what yours specifically says to you, right? Take some time, figure it out, write it down. That way, when you hear those specific things in your brain, you know exactly where it's coming from, okay? So that's question number one. Question number two is, when does it typically show up? So when does your inner critic typically show up? I'm going to share with you 7 different times that it might show up, but these are not the only times. But just to kind of give some examples of when you might notice your inner critic showing up, it might show up when you are facing a new challenge. So when you're stepping out of your comfort zone or trying something new, that inner critic might arise and question your abilities and predict that you're going to fail and just instill different forms of like doubt in you. So that's one time that it might show up. It may also show up when you've experienced, you tried something and it didn't turn out the way that you expected. So you may have experienced some failure, or you may have made a mistake. And after making a mistake or experiencing failure, the inner critic can become particularly harsh. And it'll replay the events that didn't turn out or didn't go the way you wanted. It'll just replay it over and over again, and it'll focus on what you did wrong. So you're just having that replay in your mind over and over and over again. So that's another way that the inner critic might show up, or when it might show up. It might also show up like when in comparison to others. So when you're comparing yourself to other people, especially if you perceive the other person to be more successful than you, or maybe be more talented than you, or be better in some way, the inner critic might amplify those feelings of inadequacy, right? Because now you're not as good as this person, and you'll never get what they can have, or it just kind of amplifies it, right? Another way that the inner critic might show up is if you're experiencing, if you're in a high stress situation. So during high pressure situations, such as like if you have a job interview, or if you're taking an important exam, or if you have a big presentation, or just something that's super important to you, the inner critic can heighten your feelings of anxiety by causing you to focus on all the potential mistakes that you could make, or all the different, like all of your shortcomings, right? And so now you're feeling anxious. It's got you feeling anxious and worried and nervous in this situation that's already high stress. Another time that you might notice your inner critic showing up is if you're trying to be perfect. So if you're a perfectionist, and if you have perfectionist tendencies, the inner critic might constantly remind you that your efforts aren't good enough, and that leading to a persistent sense of dissatisfaction. So you're going to always just feel dissatisfied because you're always reminded that you're just not good enough. Or it might show up when you're receiving some criticism. So when you're receiving feedback, even if it's constructive, the inner critic can interpret it as a personal attack, leading you to feel like worthless or feel like a failure. So your inner critic can cause you to interpret things in a way that's kind of it is like speaking down to you, right? And then the seventh one that I got today of when it might show up is when you set, like if you set really high expectations for yourself, or maybe you set unrealistic expectations for yourself. The inner critic can pop up and emphasize the gap between like where you are and where you want to be, and just kind of focus on that gap, the things that you don't have to get you where you actually want to be, right? So those are different times that your inner critic can show up. Those are different examples. Those are not the only times that they can show up. So when does yours tend to show up? And then also, next question. Question number 3, what is your inner critic's mission? So based on everything that we know about our inner critic, what would you guess that its mission is for you? So for me, sometimes I feel like my inner critic wants to just hold me back. Like hold me back from trying anything and accomplishing anything that's important to me. It just wants me to stay put, like stop moving, stop trying to move up, stop trying, don't even try. It's almost like an anchor holding me down and trying to keep me exactly where I'm at. Um, but what about you? What would you guess that the intentions of your inner critic are based off of when it shows up and what it says and things like that? Like what would you guess uh your inner critic's mission is? All right, question number 4 for a 7. Okay, if you were to imagine someone saying these things to you, like all the things that your inner critic says to you, who or what would they look like? So now I'm asking you to kind of visualize what your inner critic looks like. And does it remind you of a TV character or a cartoon character, or like a character from a scary movie? I remember one of my clients told me that their inner critic looks like the girl from The Ring. I don't know if you guys remember that movie, but it was like a girl. She just had, you never saw her face. She just had like a white gown on, and then all of her hair was like in her face. She had black hair. You never saw the face. And it was kind of long. It came maybe to her chest or whatever. So that, like, my client felt like her inner critic looked like that. I like, for me, my client uh reminds me of, I wouldn't say she looks like Lady Featherington from Bridgerton, but she reminds me of Lady Featherington from Bridgerton, because Lady Featherington she used to always say slick stuff to Penelope, just putting her down and counting her out as if she wasn't good enough for like marriage or contributing anything of value or anything worthwhile to the family. She completely counted her out. And you would hear it in all these little comments that she would say to her, especially in this last season, season number 3. I was like, dang. And so when I started doing this inner critic assignment, I instantly thought of Lady Featherington. So my inner critic reminds me of Lady Featherington from Bridgerton. Um, and the thing is like, if you think about it, Penelope was close to her mom. It was her mom, right? And her mom was saying all these negative things to her about how she basically didn't amount to much, wouldn't be considered, should take the first guy who wants to marry her because she probably won't ever be considered again. You know, she's lucky that this one person wants her. Like, it was horrible. And but the thing is that's her mom. So when someone is telling you these negative things and that person is close to you, you're going to be more likely to believe that person, right? And so, similar to me, my brain, right, my inner critic, obviously I'm close to my brain, right? It's like we're one. And so when it tells me things like that I'm not good enough or it'll never work or it's going to fail, it's like you just kind of sort of automatically believe those things because you're so close. Like, why would it say something so negative if it wasn't true? It must be true because we're so close and you're saying these things. And I feel like when we're not kind of aware of what our inner critic is and how it operates, it's easier for us to believe the things that it says. But then that's the thing that kind of holds us back. So like, yeah. So I just Lady Featherington is, she's my inner critic. And then, so what about you? What does your inner critic look like? Who does it remind you of? Let me know. Now, what I want you to do is think of a name for your inner critic. So, what name is fitting for your inner critic? That's question number 5. What name is fitting for your inner critic? So, for me, I name my inner critic Anchor Featherington. Um, should it be Lord Anchor Featherington or Lady Anchor Featherington? But yeah, that's what I name mine. One, because of the anchor that's trying to hold me back, and then keep me down, keep me in my one spot. And then Featherington, because of all the slick stuff that it says that causes me to feel doubt and insecure and like fear of failure and things like that. So Anchor Featherington is the name that I give my inner critic. What about you? And let me just say that getting to know your inner critic and visualizing it helps us to separate ourselves from the inner critic. So when we can see ourselves and then see our inner critic, then it allows us to make decisions based off of what we actually want, not what our inner critic is trying to get us to believe. When we can separate, we can kind of see it better. So this activity, it might seem a little silly, but it has benefits that can be life-changing, all right? Okay, so we got 2 more questions. Question number 6. Question number 6 is, what advice would you give a friend if you overheard someone speaking to them the way that your inner critic speaks to you? So most of us, based off of what we know that our inner critic says and how it shows up and all of that, most of us will probably offer like empathy or kindness to our friends if we heard them getting talked to like that. We might even encourage them to cut ties or to distance themselves from someone who's speaking to them like that. We may even, give our friend a pep talk and ensure them that they are capable and they are worthy and all of the things. So how can you apply some of that to, like, how can we apply that to ourselves when our inner critic is talking and saying things to us that cause us to feel doubt or insecure, right? So, and then question number 7, which is the last question, how can we use, or how can you use what you now know about your inner critic to your benefit? So now that you've realized all of the things about your inner critic, how can you use this information to your benefit? So for me, I feel like I can just disregard most of the things that it says, because now that I know that its intention is to kind of like hold me down, keep me from moving forward. And it says things that isn't even true, right? Like it might tell me that I'm not capable of accomplishing something, and then I might accomplish it. So it's not always true, right? What our inner critic says. So it's like something that I don't have to believe. Especially like when I think of Lady Featherington, and who had basically, it seemed like no belief in her daughter's ability, and who couldn't see all of her daughter's good qualities. Like, that's my inner critic. It doesn't see my good qualities. It's only focused on my shortcomings. It's trying to talk me out of moving forward. So since I know that that's what it does when it says something to me, and I know that when it says something to me, it's not always true. So when it says something to me, I can disregard it. I don't necessarily have to just believe it. So instead of believing everything it says, I can doubt everything it says. And that works to my benefit. Because if it's talking down to me like I can never accomplish something and I'm doubting that, then I'm going to be more likely to go after the thing that I want to try to accomplish. All right. So what about you? How can you use what you now know about your inner critic to your own benefit? All right, so you know me, as always, we got some homework, and your homework is to answer these 7 questions that I just asked you. Let me recap the questions for you. Number 1, what does your inner critic say to you? Number 2, when does it typically show up? Number 3, what is your inner critic's mission? Number 4, who or what does your inner critic look like? Number 5, what is a fitting name for your inner critic? Number 6, what advice would you give a friend if you overheard someone speaking to them the way that your inner critic speaks to you? And number 7, how can you use what you now know about your inner critic to your advantage? So that is the homework. I encourage you to take some time this week to answer all 7 of the questions. And I also encourage you to be attentive and be more aware of your inner critic and how it's showing up and when it's showing up. Just kind of notice it, just kind of get to know it a little better. Because the more you know it, the better you're going to be able to manage it and overcome it. All right. So that is your homework for this week. And as always, thank you guys for listening. I know this work will be very helpful, so please try it out. This is just one of the many activities that you can do to coach yourself. So as always, thanks again for listening, and I look forward to connecting with you in the next episode. But until next time, be your own coach and make things happen.